G'day folks, ZiggyD here. Earlier I predicted that with the what we're working on post that Necropolis would be saved, and I think that was possibly an understatement. They put out the patch far sooner than expected, and I think it has turned it from one of the more obtuse and difficult to get into and more tedious crafting systems into probably one of the most powerful crafting systems, but also one of the most simplest. Normally when crafting in Path of Exile, you have a multi-stage procedure where at each step in the crafting process, you have a bunch of different things that can occur, and then a bunch of different things that you'll have to do in response to those. If you land this, you'll have to do this. If you get an empty affix slot, you'll be able to do this, and if you don't, you'll have to do this gamble, and so on and so forth. Crafting is extremely satisfying and very engaging in Path of Exile, but it can be quite complicated and take a lot of steps to do. In this Necropolis crafting system instead though, for comparison, you basically create a recipe, follow the recipe, and craft the item in basically just one step. There is a bit of tedium in getting the corpses and planting them in the ground, but a lot of the time you're going to be able to do a insanely good craft to produce a near perfect or very usable item in just a few hours, and it's extremely deterministic. The process for figuring out what your craft recipe is going to be is also very simple as well. That said, I know some of you will be very hesitant to even try any crafting system, let alone something that looks pretty complicated, because you kind of want to look at mod tags and you kind of want to look at another website, right, to figure out what your craft recipe is going to be. So I want to explain the basics of this so that you can do it blind if you want. And I also want to explain very simply how to set up and follow a crafting recipe for yourself so that this can just be the simplest mechanic for you to engage with as possible. Because I really do think this is one of the easiest crafting systems we've ever had in Path of Exile, and also one of the most powerful, so I think it'd be a real shame for some of you to miss it who are kind of just like on the borderline of maybe dipping your toes into crafting. I want to make this as accessible as possible for you, so let's try and do just that. The basics of Necropolis crafting are really quite simple. You decide on the item that you want to make. So let's say you want to make just an energy shield chest with high energy shield. You then determine which modifiers are the things that you want on that. So you want defense modifiers to make energy shield as high as possible. So then you stack as many as you can increased chance of defense modifiers. You may also determine that you want resistances with that. So you will also do things like increased chance of resistance modifiers. You may decide that you want a specific resistance, like you really need fire resistance, so you might do increased chance of fire modifiers as well. The next step is to decrease the mods you don't want. So you'll look for these mods are scarcer. We don't want reflect on our energy shield chest, so we'll do things like physical mods are scarcer. We don't want life, so we'll do life as scarcer. Maybe we're doing a chaos inoculation build, so we don't want chaos resistance. And since we added resistance modifiers are more common, we want to make sure that we make chaos modifiers scarcer to make sure that we don't land that one when we do land a resistance. We also may determine things like we don't need mana, so we'll do mana modifiers as scarcer. So you may be wondering, how do I find out what are these modifiers? How do I figure out what defense actually means? And what is energy shield? If you look at an item in-game and hold the Alt key, it'll show next to the advanced text above each modifier the tags on the right-hand side in italics there, so the bolded italics. So life is tagged as life, pretty obvious, but you can see fire damage to attacks is tagged as damage, elemental, fire, and attack. That means if you wanted to block attack modifiers like this on a pair of gloves, because you just wanted purely energy shield gloves and you don't want any fire damage to attacks, you will make elemental modifiers are scarcer, fire modifiers are scarcer, and attack modifiers are scarcer. So there's actually 3 ways of reducing that specific modifier. Now this is only really helpful if you have some items to look at in-game, so there is various ways that you can find out this information in a much better and more useful fashion on external websites. The easiest one and most relevant to crafting for Necropolis anyway is Path of Exile. Go to the item that you want. So if we're trying to make body armor, we'll select body armor, and then we'll select the intelligence body armor if we're doing an energy shield based. And then we can look down here, and these base modifiers are the default modifiers that can spawn on an item. So this is what can spawn when you alchemy or chaos orb an item. Next to each of these, you'll see the tags, and they're color coded as well for convenience. So energy shield has defenses, life has life, mana has mana. Intelligence is the attribute tag, chaos resist is chaos and resistance, and so on and so forth. With this, you can get all of the information you need to be able to just blind craft in Necropolis without a recipe. I recommend going through the steps of a recipe, but I understand some of you want to play in that style. And with this information, you can do just that. You can say, okay, well, I want defenses, so I'll do increased defenses. I don't want life, I'll do life is scarcer. I don't want mana, I'll do mana is scarcer. And I want specific resistances, so I'll make those more common, and I'll make the other ones I don't want less common. I also don't want attributes, so maybe I'll make attributes more scarcer, and so on. The next core element to know about this crafting system is the modifier tier rating. These are relatively common, but are used in basically every craft, so they'll remain quite valuable. What does this one do? The good thing is the system here shows you exactly what it does. If we select one of these plus 50 to modifier tier ratings and bury it, and then we go to craft an item, it'll show just here, underneath the modifier tier rating, the exact effect that it's having. The lowest 34% of modifier tiers cannot roll. What this means is if we go back to Path of Exile here and we select Energy Shield, you'll see if we click it and expand upon it, these are all the different tiers of Energy Shield that you can roll. So you'll see you can roll anything from 11% to 110% increased Energy Shield. With that 50 that we added, the bottom 33%, so the first couple tiers here of really bad roll Energy Shields, cannot roll anymore. So if you roll Energy Shield, it's going to roll something above that. To keep it as simple as possible, it's a no-brainer that you want to stack a fair bit of this to try and make sure that the modifiers that you roll are high tier and the item ends up being good. Typically around plus 400 to modifier tier rating guarantees a tier 2 modifier. But something around 300 will often produce a tier 3, 2 and 1 mixed bag item, which can be very usable at endgame and still end up being a very good item. More is better, but there are diminishing returns, and because these are somewhat valuable and used in every craft, you don't necessarily want to go too far over 400 unless you're trying to make a perfect item. You'll notice that it's just every single modifier, it affects everything equally. This used to be much more complicated and needed more explanation, but now, as it's just a global modifier, I don't really even need to explain anything more than that. So that is the basics, but let's talk about how to make an actual recipe, very simple to actually follow, to make yourself your perfect, or at least very good item, as efficiently as possible. So I, for my tornado build, wanted to make a wand with +1 or 2 gems for my skill, and also crit chance and crit multiplier. That was the item I decided that I wanted to make. So let's go through the process of how I would find out the recipe for that item so that I could craft it. Once you know this process, you'll be able to do it for any item that you want. So once again, we'll go to Path of Exile, and we'll select the item that we want. In this case, I want either a wand or a scepter. They're both same in this case. So we'll go one-handed weapons, and we'll choose a wand. Now what we're going to do is select Graveyard and tag this. This is the crafting method that we'll be using. It brings up the options here. We can ignore all this for now, don't worry about it. And then we'll scroll down here to the prefixes and suffixes and the base modifiers here. As you can see, weapons are a little bit more complicated than the body armor that we looked at earlier, as they have more possible modifiers. But the end result here will be really simple. All that we do is we select all of the modifiers that we do want that would work for our build. Now, Tornado has the fire, cold, and lightning tags, so we can actually use any of those in our build, which makes this craft much easier for us. It doesn't have plus chaos skills though, it won't work for that. So what we'll do is we'll come down and we'll select cold skill gems, and then we'll select level of all fire skill gems and lightning. Physical also works for it, as it's also a physical skill, and the generic +1 level of all spell gems. So we have all of our prefixes selected now because that's the main thing we really care about. Then I said I wanted crit chance and crit multiplier. So we'll go increase crit chance for spells. And then you'll notice that this one has tiers. These ones didn't have tiers, they're just all or nothing. But for this one we have tiers. Now the more restrictive you are, the more of those mod tier ratings corpses you'll need to stack together. We want an item that's nearly perfect, but we don't necessarily need it to be perfect, so we'll select tier 2 as that'll make the craft much quicker to do and much easier in the end. But if you want to make a perfect item, then go for it and select tier 1. If you're playing solo self-found and just getting started, you might select tier 3, for example, to make a still very good item, but not necessarily top tier, something you can replace later on. I also now need to select my critical strike multiplier there, and I'll also select tier 2 for that as well. There's a bunch of other things that I could use, but we don't need to be too specific with this. Especially as if we get these things, then I can benchcraft one remaining affix and have an insanely good item. So I'll shrink myself down here so I don't cover anything important. And once we have all of our modifiers selected, we'll scroll up here and it'll show the currently selected affixes that we have. Now there's something important that I want to note over here. You'll see these check marks. Now all of these +1 cold, fire, lightning, and spell gems are mutually exclusive. You can only ever have one of them on an item. And they're also just as good as each other for our build. We don't care which one we get. As such, they're all selected here in the same column. What this means, all being in the same column, is it means that one of the affixes on the item needs to be any one of those, but I don't care which. You'll notice at the plus level of all spell skill gems, this can actually roll alongside of this, creating a +2 wand. So this is in a separate column. This means that the item must have any one of these, and then this. So it's saying it must have that. Now you'll notice it automatically defaulted the crit multiplier and crit chance to be on the same column as well. So currently the wand will have +2, but either crit multi or crit chance. We do actually want both, so we'll separate them. It doesn't matter which column we have, just as long as they're separate, because if they're together, it's saying I want one or the other. Here it's saying I need both. Now this +1 wand right here is perfectly acceptable. You can see with Chaos Orbs, this would take a whopping 36,000 crafts. Pretty crazy. However, +2 is the ideal outcome, so we will go for that. You'll notice that with Chaos Orbs, this would take approximately 60 million Chaos Orbs. Pretty crazy. Let's see how good we can get that with Necropolis instead. Now we have two options, Quick Suggest, which just does some quick maths and gives you a pretty good result. It's quite reliable, but we can also wait a little bit longer and do Compute Best Selection, and it'll give you the best possible recipe, at least as far as Path of Exile and the developer, who is phenomenal, has created here. So we'll click this and wait. Take Peter, don't you come, girls, I can go. I sold my soul to the company store. All right, there we have it. It's now calculated a full graveyard craft, the best possible option, and we can get that craft that costs 60 million or something it was, in an average of 2 attempts. So obviously it's insanely good. If we lowered the tier of crit multiplier or crit chance or something that we wanted, it would be even easier. And if we move it to +1 gems, it's going to be even more likely. But at this point, 2 attempts, you basically can't get better than that. However, like I said, this is a full 88 graveyards, and that's a bit much. That's overkill. So our next step is going to just be to slim this down to something a bit more reasonable, because at this point, we're spending way too much value of corpses to craft something that's overly likely when we don't really need this quite level of confidence. So what we're going to do is we're going to start trimming off some of the options here and just seeing how that affects the number of tries. Now over here, you'll see the full list of what's being used. Now the first thing I have to trim is that I want my wand to only have 5 affixes so that I can use the crafting bench to add a specific modifier to it. So what I'll do is I'll cut down one of the explicit modifiers. Whenever you do a Necropolis craft, it does 4 affixes, and then you can add corpses that add +1 affix to it. So if you add +1, it becomes a 5 affix item, and if you add another one, it becomes a 6 affix item. I want specifically a 5 affix item so that I can bench craft it. It's very powerful that you can do that, and do pay attention to that option. Most crafts will become more likely if you use the full 6 affixes, as it gives more chances to roll each affix. Now you can see lowering the explicit count here didn't affect it because we're already so close to like perfect, deterministic craft level. But as we start trimming things, that will have a bit of an impact, but it's an acceptable cost because we want to be able to bench craft the item. The next thing we'll do is we'll look for any like particularly high art numbers, and you'll notice that the modifier tier rating is set to 1100. This basically guarantees that we'll get tier 1, and that is not necessary. So I'm going to cut this down to about, I said 400 is about usually necessary to hit tier 2. And you can see that cutting it all the way down there saved a lot of corpses and a lot of money, and only took it down to 4 tries for the +2 wand and 3 tries for the +1 wand. Very acceptable. 400 is a pretty good goal to aim for typically, unless you're trying to make a perfect item, then you might want to go for more like 700-ish or something. You'll also notice that it's got 12 stacks of attack modifiers are scarcer. There are a lot of attack modifiers that can roll on wands. We're not boosting the rate of any of those happening really, except for one particular crit modifier. So we do want to keep a couple of these, but we can definitely cut this down substantially. I'll try cutting it down to 600 and see how it goes. It's still only 5 tries. And again, that's to get the perfect possible result. You can still get a very good result, even if you miss that 1 in 5. And again, with a 1 wand, it's still 3 tries. So we can cut out a lot here. I'm going to try and get this down to like 20 corpses-ish. I'll cut down the excess extra chaos and mana and just have these as 1. So all of the relevant reductions, the scarces, I'll just have those as a single 300 stack, and you can see that hasn't even made a difference. Now the other thing is that we have a very large amount of critical modifiers and gem modifiers increased. We definitely don't need that many. I'm going to cut it down very aggressively and then we'll come back from there. Alright, so I've reduced this to 29 corpses, only 5 critical and 5 gems now, and you'll see that for the +2 wand it's 14 tries, and for the +1 wand it's 3 tries. That's still very acceptable and high numbers there, compared to the 60 million Chaos Orbs. So all I did was very straightforward. I just lowered the number of total corpses used, right, to a much more feasible 1/4 graveyard craft. Something that would only take a couple of hours to do, or maybe a few trades here and there just to pad out the ones that you're missing. With this amount, you can also have one of these cooking for a while you also work on another craft. I quite like that strategy of crafting something like this and also crafting like an armor piece at the same time that's using different modifiers that this craft isn't using. Keep in mind that the miss result here, so if this is 1 in 14 to hit a +2 and 1 in 3 to hit a +1, what this actually means is that you might just miss on something like the crit multiplier. It doesn't necessarily mean you won't get a +2, you might get a +2 but with no crit multiplier, and it counts that as a miss. In that case, you've still made a very good weapon that you can still end up using. Once you get to this point, you can start to tinker with just how much extra value you get for adding to this craft. So if we're at 14, 1 in 14 tries, and I add another critical modifier, how much does that help? Okay, it doesn't have any impact. Does that mean I could cut the crit down further? Okay, cutting 1 out only lowers it by 1 try. That's not too bad. Maybe I could kind of skimp a little bit on the crit ones here. If I add another gem one, how much does that help? That actually makes it 2 tries more likely. So maybe that's where I want to invest instead, in a couple more gem ones to try and get that down. So you can find kind of the breakpoint where you're satisfied with how much diminishing returns or how much impact you're getting out of adding more corpses. Does adding another attack modifier as a scarcer make a big difference? It makes 1 try difference. It's like, okay, maybe that's something that I'm happy to go for. So tinker with it and just figure out like what things are the most impactful and what things are kind of doing nothing. If I drop one of the mana corpses, maybe I can't be bothered trading for one. How much of an impact does that have? Okay, it adds 3 extra tries. That's not ideal, so it's definitely pretty efficient to add it, but maybe not the end of world if I don't do that. Now, this is all well and good, making a recipe like this, and that looks pretty good, especially compared to that 60 million chaos, but does it actually work? Yes, here's my wand. I crafted one of these, I got +1, I didn't get the +2, but instead, I happened to roll tier 1 fire damage to spells, a perfectly acceptable substitute for the +2 because it probably gives a similar amount of damage in the end. You'll notice I got tier 1 critical with a nice roll, tier 1 crit multi with a nice roll, and my open affix, which I specified had to be there for the bench craft. There was maybe 50-50 on whether that was going to be a suffix or a prefix. And I ended up getting projectile speed, which isn't useful, but that one is very, very nice. That was just one attempt there. I used about this many corpses. I think I went slightly over thanks to some of the meta crafts that make some of these slightly more efficient. But really, this was pretty much the exact recipe that I used. You can see here's my actual recipe. It was actually a little slimmer than this. I went for 27 graves used only, which put me at 18 tries for a +2 and 4 tries for a +1. So once you've come up with your recipe and tuned it to the level of threshold for success that you want, then the other thing you need to do is select the base item. Now you can now select the exact item that you want. They buffed it phenomenally. So you can even go into a wand and select the exact one that you want. So you want the profane one for cast speed, or you want like a really low level one for low intelligence requirements, you can do that. Same for basically everything here, except some very specific bases. Like for example, if you want to do a Stygian Vise belt, you'll need to find a corpse that allows that. You'll plant that in, and then it'll give you that option. To figure out which base you maybe want, if you're not very familiar with them, then you can come to powewiki.net and just type in the search bar at the top here, the item category you want, so wand, and then you can scroll down the list of wands and take a look at exactly what they do. So we can see Profane Wand here has 237 intelligence requirement and gives 14 cast speed. A lower option is 184 intelligence, maybe if you don't have a lot of intelligence, that gives 10 cast speed, so you can kind of get an idea of your options there. Now, some extra little things that you can add to make your craft a little bit nicer is you can increase the quality with these corpses here. These are relatively common. Each one of them adds 5 quality up to 30. This is obviously very good on armor for increasing the total amount of energy shield or whatever that you get, but it can also be good for later things like harvest crafts, which do alternate things with qualities. Obviously for physical weapons, it's essential as it increases the physical damage of the weapon. So keep an eye on those, and it's often worth taking an item to 30 quality. Another really important thing that you'll want to note is that your item is the right level. When we're looking at these affixes here, you'll notice that there are item levels written next to each affix. So for the plus gem levels, it's 2. And for the plus all levels, it's 55. And then for the crit chance, the highest tier is 76. And the highest tier of crit multi is 73. So we know that our wand needs to be level 76 to get all of the affixes that we want. As a side note, going above that actually wouldn't help us, as it would make it more likely to roll other affixes we don't want. The level is determined by the average-ish level of the corpses you use. So this is an 83 level corpse, so the item produced will be an 83 item. But if I use a mixture of like level 70 corpses and 83s, it might end up being something like in the high 70s. It's kind of like an average with a plus modifier. What you can do though is if you're using some lower level corpses, but you need to reach a certain item level, you can tune it up by using +1 to item level corpses here. So just make sure you double check, and this is very important, that you have at least the item level you need for all of the affixes that you want to use. If I was trying to roll like the higher spell damage, for example, then I would need to make sure our wand was at least item level 84. So I'd need to use some 83 corpses to bring the average up as high as possible, and then I'd need to use maybe one or a couple plus item levels to bring it up to 84. Another thing you can do is pre-6 link your item. There are corpses like this that add +1 to minimum number of linked sockets. You need 3 that say a maximum of 4, and then you need a maximum of 5 to make it 5 linked, and then you need 1 corpse that makes a maximum of 6 to make it 6 linked. That's the most efficient way to do it. You can use several +1s with maximum of 5 and then just a 6 link one on top of that if you want. The good thing is once you plant this, it'll actually show you in the craft menu just how many links it'll have when you like select like armor or a two-handed weapon or something like that. It'll show you just how many links it'll have. You can also see over here how many explicit modifiers. Like I said, it defaults at 4. So if you add one with the corpses, it'll say 5 here. You can also lower it to 3 for some unusual crafts. Now you may have seen like posted on Reddit or something like intense perfect layout optimization things. That stuff is really not necessary for most crafts, especially if you're only using like 30 corpses or something like that. You don't really need to worry about that at all. If you're trying to do some ridiculous perfect item with a full graveyard craft, then you may want to start considering optimizing your layout. But that said, you can still take advantage of some of those meta corpses, and they are typically pretty cheap. So there are corpses that do things like 25% boost to everything in that row or column. What you want to do is stack your most important modifiers. So it might be for us, like with our wand, might be plus gem levels. So we'll put plus gem levels here and here and here and here, all along here, or maybe mod tier rating, because this is always important. So we'll stack those up, and then we'll put at the end, or any one of these corpses in this column, we'll say 25% boost to everything in that column. And that'll just make all of those a bit more efficient. Same deal for row. We'll find a nice long row, like this one here, fill it with very valuable corpses, and put one of those corpses as 25% boost to everything in this column. There's also some adjacency ones, so you can kind of try and work around those if you want, but like I said, it's not vitally important. It just gives you a little bit of an efficiency boost, effectively potentially saving you some currency on some of the more valuable corpses. If things like gem levels are scarcer, are pretty expensive, for example, maybe they cost like 50 chaos plus, then boosting them with some of those 25% boost column row things will save you some money effectively. Another fun one is, one more fun corpse that I like to do before I start my craft is there's a corpse that randomizes it when planted and anything adjacent to it. So what you'll do is you'll put 4 low value or unwanted corpses in a star like this, like this fizz, life, defense, and +1 here. And then in the middle, you'll put the corpse randomizer and it'll randomize itself and all of the linked ones. So I did one here and I got life modifiers are scarcer, defense, +1 item level, and fizz. Then what you'll do is you'll just exhume any corpses you don't want and then you'll do your craft there. This just gives you the chance of getting some rare or valuable or useful crafts that maybe you don't have access to and jumping you ahead. by using some corpse randomization here at some point, I earlier got this divine orb one here, which is quite nice. So I'll leave this here and then I'll just link a craft to it at some point. Just a bit of extra fun way to get some rare corpses. Anyway, folks, I hope this was straightforward enough to help some of you get into this crafting, because it really is insane. It would be a shame to miss out on this because I doubt it'll be going cool. Anyway, that's it for now. I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.